did you get the nickname End Zone? It seems that maybe in hindsight would be pretty obvious because you spent so much time there. But was it? Is that the reason behind it? You were just spent so much time in the end zone?
Well, we got to go back to high school. My senior year in high school is when my teammates, a couple of my teammates, were teasing around and trying to come up with a nickname for me. And yes, because of the touchdowns, one of the guys were clever enough to say End Zone Jones. So it stuck. I liked it, and it stuck. And it's interesting because even to the day, that's how most people know me, is by End Zone Jones. And even more ironically, when you look me up on Wikipedia, when you look up Keith Jones, it pulls up another gentleman who played football, also played for the University of Illinois. He actually played in the NFL for a few years also. And so it pulls him up. And I found out that if you want to look me up and get my information on Wikipedia, you have to put in Keith End Zone Jones. So for those out there who try to look me up, you got to put in Keith End Zone Jones in order to find out anything about my history and credentials, I guess. So,
well, fair enough. That's a good. It's good to get a nickname that sticks with you. Among your family and friends, did it stick too? I mean, it's always kind of weird because I have a nickname here at work too, and then I go home, and if my wife calls me by my nickname, it almost bothers me a little bit. Do you have the same type of feeling?
Yeah. It's interesting because a lot of my old teammates and some of my newer friends, that's what they call me. But instead of End Zone, a lot of times they call me EZ for short. And that's what a lot of them call me EZ. So.
Well, fair enough. That works out as well. We went through your kind of high school year, your decision not to redshirt in 1984. 1985, you had 38 carries on 240 yards total, 138 of those coming in against Iowa State and Kansas there. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting, yet the first kickoff return touchdown in 5 years for the Huskers against Kansas, and then 98-yarder for a touchdown. Was that something they kept you doing once you got more of a prominent role as the feature eye back, or was that kind of something that you did just earlier in your career?
Well, it was more early in my career. Since I didn't redshirt, they just wanted to make sure I was, getting some ample enough time, at least to be on the field, and doing special teams gave me that opportunity.
Now let's jump forward to and by the way, all these years as we go through, and now that we get more into your playing years, I'll more specifically kind of go into it. But obviously, you came into Nebraska at a time where they were just coming off close to the national championship in 1983. And all these years, as opposed to the current years, Nebraska was in there fighting for that. I wanted to ask you about this just in general, because I know Oklahoma was just kind of a thorn in your side, in Tom Osborne's side throughout that time in your career. Before we get specifically into the game in your junior and senior seasons, Nebraska now kind of has this rivalry with Iowa, and it's just hard to replicate what the Nebraska-Oklahoma rivalry was, because, these Nebraska-Iowa games, we might battle for going to a bowl game or maybe to represent the Big Ten West or something like that. Back then, the Nebraska-Oklahoma rivalry was to go to the Orange Bowl, to go to the national championship. What were those games like with the Sooners?
Yeah. There's no comparison with the Nebraska-Iowa game each season. Back then, historically, you're looking at the Big 8 conference, and generally it was Nebraska and Oklahoma. And like you said, those games always came down to national contention, playing to go to the Orange Bowl to play for a national championship. So, and like you said, during those years, especially, even my freshman, all 4 of my years, that game came down, to had a lot of implications on those games. And it may have been one year where Oklahoma kind of handled us pretty easily at Oklahoma. But other than that, the other games were always competitive, and were always a lot of stakes during that game.
Yeah, again, I mean, most of the time your career in Nebraska was a top 10 team, even rising to number 1 several times. So it's a bit of a different feeling than what it is here now today, and hopefully Nebraska can get back to that. But I did want to ask you about 1986. You're going into that your junior season. Doug DuBose has been on a roll, and then before the season happens, he gets a season-ending injury. Of course, everybody on the team must have been thinking, okay, next man up, and that was you. So what was kind of the feeling through that offseason and entering that first game against Florida State, where it's okay, I've been a piece of the team, now I'm a featured piece?
Well, it was, it was a shocker to the team. It was disappointing. That year, Doug was one of the leading Heisman candidates. And I mentioned earlier that I always enjoyed being in a position where I was chasing someone. And Doug had a standard, and he had set that bar, pretty high. So going into that season, I was actually looking forward to continuing to learn from him, to compete with him, and to really have kind of like that 1-2 punch against our opponents going into that season. And unfortunately, when he went down, the whole outlook changed. The whole perspective of what my role was going to be changed. And it was next man up. It really was. That did hurt some of the depth at that time, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, going into that season, Ken Clark had decided to redshirt that year. And I think he would have been a backup with the depth. But because, Doug going into that season was going to be the man, and then me backing him up, Ken made a strategic move to redshirt. And unfortunately, Doug got injured. The outlook on the season, slightly changed, because one of our, strong leaders, weren't going to be on the field with us. But I think going into that season, we were still confident. It still ranked pretty high going into that season, and played well throughout that season. And unfortunately, we mentioned Oklahoma earlier. Ran into Oklahoma at the end of that season and lost that game. And so that was left a bad taste in my mouth, because we were unable to, accomplish some of the things that we had set out to accomplish that season, with Doug DuBose being one of our leaders.
On just looking through your bio, I mean, that Oklahoma team, it says that you ran, had a 2-yard touchdown against the Sooners. That was the only one they allowed, only rushing touchdown they allowed in 1986. Also was the only first quarter score against Oklahoma that season. So, I mean, Oklahoma just had a heck of a teams there. And it was kind of funny too, because I was reading through your bio and realized that South Carolina is kind of the same way. These were very tough, and Nebraska had a home and away with South Carolina at the time. These were very tough rush defenses going in. In those bigger games with those rush defenses, did you pay too much attention to the numbers? I mean, because you talk about that Oklahoma number. I mean, these are some. I mean, that's got to be a little bit frightening, I suppose, to the stand. The guy in the crowd watching, like, man, I'm going to get this rush game going. But for you on the field, you see those rush defensive numbers. What were you licking your chops to go prove them wrong?
Well, it's one of the things that Coach Osborne and his coaching staff, they always did a great job of scouting and putting a game plan together and getting us ready as a team, knowing what the other team's strengths were and what their weaknesses were. And that's how we attack teams. They were amazing defensively, both the South Carolina teams, the Oklahoma teams, and I would be remiss to not mention UCLA. My junior year, and then after I left, Nebraska played them out there at UCLA. But those were tremendous defensive teams, and so our offenses were always tested when we played against those teams, and some of the memories not so great when it came down to the outcome of the games, especially against Oklahoma when we would lose that game. But in retrospect, when you look at how well put together those Oklahoma defensive teams were, when you look at the number of All-Americans they had, the number of first-round draft picks they had, the number of guys that played at the next level in the NFL, that pretty much tells the story as to how good those defensive teams were.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll jump into 1987 too, but I think it's kind of interesting, as you mentioned that, just, how close you guys were in 1987. Of course, there was that Oklahoma team that stood in your way, set up for a number 1 versus number 2. You guys obviously started the year number 2. There was a lot of expectations going in, but rose up to number 1 for that Oklahoma week, and ended up losing that game 17-7, and then just a 3-point loss in the Sugar Bowl, in the Fiesta Bowl against Florida State. That 87 team, of course, your senior season, we can go over your numbers here in a bit because they were spectacular, and it was kind of your breakout year, even more so than your junior year, which you already led the Big 8 in rushing touchdowns. How close do you feel that team was to a national title?
Oh my goodness, we were so close. And, the setback for us, of course, playing Oklahoma in Lincoln, my senior year, the game started out, with a bang. I think I scored on like a 21-yarder or something like that. And, their defense would bend, but it would never break. So we would move the ball offensively, but then they would just bow up defensively. And of course we would have to punt the ball, but we just could not get over the hump against those Oklahoma defensive teams then. And then you mentioned Florida State, that game we played them in the Fiesta Bowl, winning at halftime with the league. Matter of fact, led the majority of that game. And as I recall, I know going into the fourth quarter, I didn't play at all, I believe, going into the fourth quarter. We were up with the lead, and Coach Solich came down and just congratulated me on a good season, and just told me that, hey, we're going to let the younger guys take over. So, I was able to take my pads off and kind of relax. And unfortunately, Florida made a comeback in that fourth quarter. And like you said, I think we ended up losing by a field goal or so.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's at the time, maybe it felt relieving, but that's in hindsight a little bit frustrating. You weren't able to carry it out and maybe get the win there. But it is interesting. You guys get to number 1. You had some early season battles against UCLA and Arizona State. You struggled a little bit against UCLA. Did that deter you at all? I mean, because you came back, it didn't look that. I get a number of 200-yard rushing games afterwards. But what kind of went into the UCLA game and afterwards?
Well, that I'm glad you mentioned that game, because I learned a lot from that game. That was one of the few games in my collegiate career that I went into that game with a little slight different mindset. If you recall, some of the personnel on UCLA's team, one of the players that they had, running back by the name of Gaston Green. Gaston was a California boy. He had was having a really good season with UCLA. And as a matter of fact, I think Gaston may have been one of the Heisman candidates that year. And so going into that game, I personally, I wanted to outplay him. And I knew that the eyes were going to be on us. The eyes were going to be on him in that game. And I felt like this would be a great opportunity for me to kind of show my abilities and my talent. And that was one of the only games that I recall during my collegiate career where I went in with that mindset, which I think most athletes will tell you. It's great to be competitive, but it's another thing when you isolate yourself and say, I want to do this, that, or the other. And I think my perspective going into that game, my approach was completely off. the game, my game showed that. It was frustrating because the UCLA had a great defense during that time, and they came to shut down the run, and that's exactly what they did during that game. I think if you look at the stats in that game, Steve Taylor broke a record for the number of touchdown passes he had, because what we had to do, we had to go to play action passes in order to be effective offensively. But that was a very frustrating game for me. I didn't play very well at all. And I recall that next week, before practice started, Coach Osborne called me to his office. And he said to me, I'm not sure what happened. He said, but it's unacceptable. And, I remember him saying, if we need to make some changes, we will. And I recall telling Coach, you know what? Nope. You don't have to worry about making any changes. I know what my approach was, and it was selfish, and it won't happen again. And I think that kind of projected me or propelled me from a mindset standpoint, preparing going forward for the rest of that season, to go in with the right approach, the right team approach, and to play my role, and not to try to necessarily be the guy or be the man, but to play my role. And that's what I did. And the rest of the season actually turned out pretty good.
Yeah, that's interesting for context here. That was number 3 UCLA against number 2 Nebraska. So, that was a heavyweight match, and you guys didn't have much long to rest on that victory because you had number 12 Arizona State, and like you said, maybe changing that mindset. Had a big 62-yard run at the end of the game to set Nebraska up for the win, to pair your 145 yards total on 17 carries in that game. So that's a heck of a performance. You had a few 200-yard rushing games later in the year, maybe to outshine that a little bit, but just to kind of give us some context there. And then just with you saying that, I thought, was it tempting to kind of think of that? Because I was going to ask you about this, because when I talk about stacked running back rooms, you guys went up against Oklahoma State when they had Thurman Thomas and Barry Sanders. Was it hard not to get back into that mindset for that game?
Well, it wasn't hard because you learn your lesson, and you understand that you got teammates, and our offense, especially with Steve at quarterback. I mean, we weren't just one-dimensional team. I mean, we had the ability to run it, to throw it, and we were very effective that way. And so, going into that Oklahoma State game, playing against Oklahoma, of course, you recognize, Thurman Thomas, who had a stellar career, Barry, Hall of Famer, great collegiate Heisman Trophy winner. I mean, so, it was just fun competing, and knowing that within the Big 8 conference at that time, that the talent that was in the conference at the time, and the respect that you have for other players. I mean, I just spoke to Barry, I'd say maybe a little bit over a year ago. He and Johnny was at a Heisman deal, and Johnny put him on the phone, so we had a chance to chat for a minute. And it's just the level of respect that you gain from guys when they're in college, and then when you go off to the NFL and play a little bit. It's you have friendships and relationships that definitely last a lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's take a quick break. We've got one more segment with Keith Endzone Jones, Nebraska running back from 1984 to 1987. Steve is out today. Steve Taylor out today, but he was your running mate back there in the backfield. What was it like to play with Steve Taylor back with the Huskers in the 80s?
Oh man, Steve was my quarterback.
Yeah.
I remember when Steve came in his freshman year, and we were doing summer workouts, and we were out in the field, he was throwing the ball around. And when I saw the tight spiral he was throwing and the velocity on the ball, and we were just running and playing a little touch football and his moves, and I was like, okay, we got something special here. And once the fall season started, and when he got a chance to step on the field for the first time as a freshman and play some of his freshman year, I think the Husker fans got excited real quick because they knew they had at least four years of elite quarterback play. And I've always had a lot of respect for Steve. As a young man coming in, he was mature. He understood the game. And I think Coach Osborne realized early on that he had a special player.
Yeah. Yeah, Steve absolutely was special, and his time here at Nebraska was as well. Wanted to get to the end of your season as well, where you really started to rack up the numbers. 248 yards against Colorado near the end. Of course, 240 a couple weeks previously to that against Iowa State. Were things clicking a little bit more at that point in time? Did it feel that way, or was that maybe the competition you were playing, or what? When did those 240 yards is a lot?
Well, I think it was more of, understanding my role. Understanding, as far as being the lead, one of the leaders on the team at the time offensively, just kind of, playing your role. And most of the times when you do that and everyone is executing, guys are making their blocks, I mean, things become, it may sound a little unusual, but it became a little easier. And that was one of the reasons why I said early on that sometimes I wish I would have maybe redshirted, because I know from a fact, going through that experience now, as confident as I was my senior year and the experience that I had, imagine coming back having one more year of eligibility left. And playing with Steve another year. I mean, I see nothing but continued high rankings and being more competitive. And I know Steve's senior year, they ended up beating Oklahoma, and they ended up going to the Orange Bowl, that year.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what their in the season ranking was or who they played in the Orange Bowl that year. But it was just one of those scenarios, situations where, I hit my stride, my senior year, and things became a lot easier, and I was confident, and all the guys around me, and I'm sure my teammates were also confident in me. So, my overall experience at Nebraska was unforgettable. And when I ended my career at Nebraska, you mentioned those last few games that I had where, the rushing yards were there. I think going into towards the end of my senior year, I would think I was like number maybe 10 or 11 going into those last few games, 10 or 11 ranked as far as all-time rushing. But by the time I finished my senior year, I ended up number 3 on the all-time rushing list, which when I look back on that, that was quite the accomplishment, because I didn't think I would end up that high on the list of all-time rushers.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Especially, with not only being able to play your junior and senior year majority, that is quite an impressive career. And Husker fans are forever grateful and thank you for choosing Lincoln, Nebraska in the Huskers to be your team. Before we finished it out, you did have a look into the pros. You did get picked in the 6th round with the Rams, ended up playing with Cleveland and Dallas. How was your experience in the NFL?
Oh, it was awesome. It was awesome because a lot of the guys I played against in college, I ended up being teammates with in the NFL. And you get a chance to talk to these guys and get to know these guys a little better and develop those relationships. And it's quite the experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I would imagine so. Once again, thank you for coming on. This is Weekly Wrap Sessions with All-American quarterback Steve Taylor, one of the greats at running back, Keith Endzone Jones, joining us for today. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So one final thank you to Keith Endzone Jones for joining us today. And bother Steve. Try to come back on again at some point.
My pleasure. Let me know. Thank you.
All right, there he goes. Keith In Zone Jones, once again, one of the greatest to ever do it at IBEC for Nebraska. All right, that'll wrap it up for the show this week. We'll stay tuned. We'll try to let you know who will join us for next week. Once again, Steve Taylor is getting some guests in for the summer for us to break down and talk to about their Husker careers and so on and so forth. So we will look forward to that next week. Happy Hour coming up next year on 93.7 The Ticket.
This is Lincoln's home for sports talk on the FM dial. Also online at theticketfm.com.
On the internet.
KNTK FM Firth 93.